Typography is way more complicated than most people think. You'd think something we've been doing since grade school would be intuitive, but it turns out there are millions of ways you can manipulate letters, and tiny changes can have huge effects. So in this design class, Typography 101, you'll learn the fundamentals of fonts so you can be an expert typographer for your personal life or your business. And I guarantee you by the end of this video, you'll never look at any website, billboard, or logo the same way again. So, what is typography? Typography is the art and science of arranging text to be both legible and appealing. The fundamental building blocks of typography are characters, and designers manipulate different parts of them to create different typefaces. When we use a certain combination of characters inside of a typeface, that's called a font. And choosing the right font is essential because we commit most of our visual attention in any design to text. Now, different fonts are like different tones of voice. A silly font might be great for a clown, but not a lawyer. And a fancy font might be perfect for a wedding photographer, but not an eye doctor. So just like you want to speak in the right tone of voice, you want to pick a font that matches the energy of the project you're working on. So we're going to go through every different kind of font and when you should use them. Starting with serif fonts. They're called that because they have little decorative lines hanging around them called serifs. When Gutenberg invented the printing press, he modeled the letters after handwritten and very fancy calligraphy. The only problem was that this took up a huge amount of space on the page and wasn't really legible. So in 1470, Nicholas Jensen invented the first serif typeface by chopping the flourishes off the calligraphy. He called this the Roman typeface based on Italian humanist script, which at the time was the modernist alternative to calligraphy. Jensen thought calligraphy was too fancy, especially for the new modern industrial printing press. And it caught on. Eventually, the Roman typeface became the standard in print for the next 200 years, and it was the basis for fonts like Times New Roman, which is now on every computer. Funnily enough, the Times, British, not American, actually created Times New Roman because they wanted to seem more traditional, even though the Roman typeface was originally invented to be anti-traditionalist. But today, tradition, stability, and enduring value is exactly what people associate serif fonts with. That's why banks, jewelers, and lawyers typically use serif typefaces in their logos and designs. These fonts are perfect if you want your design to seem timeless. You should avoid these fonts though if you're designing something contemporary or playful. For a modern look and feel, we turn to sans serif typefaces. Sans means without in French, and sans serif literally means without serifs. Now, interestingly, sans serifs are actually older than serif fonts just because it's way easier to write simply than it is to write fancy. But sans serifs typically feel more modern because modern culture is often trying to remove ostentation, fancy decoration, or anything that doesn't serve a direct purpose. So like serif fonts that were invented as a simpler version of calligraphy, sans serif fonts were invented to remove every bit of decoration from a typeface. The disadvantage of sans serif fonts is that they can look a little boring and homogeneous. A lot of fashion brands recently ditched their striking and creative typography for sort of sterile and similar typefaces, which made them all kind of look the same. But sans serifs have a couple of major advantages over every other kind of typeface. First, they're extremely versatile. Because they lack a distinct personality, they can be used pretty much anywhere. So the same font can work for a construction company, dentist, or e-commerce store. The other big advantage is that there's a lot of variability within each typeface. Usually a serif font will have two options, bold and normal. But there are thousands of sans serif typefaces which are variable, meaning you can adjust the sizing and thickness to create millions of different combinations within the same typeface. That means you can use one typeface for your entire brand. Sans serifs also tend to be more legible than serif fonts. That's why they're the preferred choice for packaging, road signs, license plates, keycaps, billboards, and roughly 90% of consumer products. So if you have a modern brand, or you're looking for more versatility, or you're optimizing for legibility, a sans serif typeface is a great choice. Now, if you're looking for a typeface that's specifically for logos, headings, or titles, that's called a display typeface. Display typefaces can be serif, sans serif, made out of weird symbols, or anything you want. They get their own category because display typefaces are designed to be unique. They don't make good paragraphs, buttons, or labels, but if you want a small chunk of text to really stand out, use a display typeface. What if you're looking for refined, subtle elegance? Then you're looking for a script typeface. A script typeface is designed to look like old school calligraphy, the kind our hard-headed friend Nicholas Jensen didn't care for. Script fonts are designed to be beautiful, classy, and timeless. Now, script typefaces are not to be confused with handwritten typefaces. Handwritten typefaces are created by the designer printing out letters in their own handwriting. So usually this comes out as more playful and less elegant. Every typeface we've seen so far has been proportional. proportional, meaning different letters take up more or less space. That's true everywhere except for monospace typefaces, where each character takes up exactly the same amount of space. And in the computer world, monospace fonts are used all the time for coding. It's a lot easier to navigate through thousands of lines of code arranged more like rows in a spreadsheet and less like paragraphs when every letter takes up the same amount of space. Now you can change way more about a piece of text than just the font. And what you change and how you change it has huge implications for the legibility and personality of your text. So I'm going to show you the 10 most important variables to be aware of when creating the typography for your next project. The fundamental building block of typography is a character, but the fundamental building block of a character is called a point. The point is the default unit of measurement in typography, and it translates in the physical world to 1/12 of an inch. So it's a unit of size. 12 points equals 1 inch. Now if you're designing for a screen, you'll likely use pixels instead of points. Now these pixels are not literal pixels on the screen, but rather another sizing convention. They aren't literal pixels because if you had a 64 pixel title, that would be half as small on a 4K screen because the 4K screen has twice as many pixels. So instead, designers agreed that a pixel should be worth 0.75 points. So 1 inch in the physical world is 16 pixels, which is the same as 12 points. But if you're just designing digitally, the most important size convention you need to know is EM and REM, or M and REM. M stands for no one's really sure. People have different ideas about it originating from the size of the letter M in the printing press. I personally think it stands for equal measurement because it's a unit of measurement that sets the size of a character equal to the size of the font. On the web, the default size of a font is 16 pixels. So if I wanted a heading to be 32 pixels, I would set it to 2M. The great advantage of designing this way is that it lets users increase or decrease the size of your typography by changing their M. This sounds like it would be hard to do, but it's actually as easy as zooming in or zooming out on a website. If you want to change the default size of M to something other than 16 pixels, you can use REM. REM stands for root EM because when designing websites in CSS, there's this thing called root, which defines stylistic variables for your website. So if I set my root EM to something bigger than 16 pixels, every part of my design that uses REM gets bigger, and it's still responsive if someone wants to zoom in or out on my website. Roughly 90% of websites are built using this M-REM model, so it's super important to understand. So size is the first major component of typography, and it's really useful for differentiating between titles, subtitles, and paragraphs. But to further increase that contrast, you can also manipulate a typeface's weight, which is the boldness or thinness of a font. Generally, the bolder fonts command more visual attention and are more likely to be used for titles and buttons, whereas thinner fonts are easier to read at smaller sizes, so they're preferable for paragraphs and labels. Weight plays a huge role in the legibility of your font. A large and extremely thin headline is usually harder to read than a bolder one. Likewise, a bold paragraph is too dense to differentiate between individual characters and leads to visual strain. Now, if you're using a serif, handwritten, or script font, you're not likely to have a huge amount of options when it comes to weight. Most of these fonts come in normal or bold, where sans serif typefaces are often designed with at least 9 different choices for weight, ranging from thin all the way up to black. Now, size and weight both affect each individual character of a font, but there are other variables which affect the font as a whole, the most important of which is called the baseline. The baseline is the invisible line upon which your font rests. If you've ever had to write on a lined paper in school, you are writing on the baseline. In the other direction, characters extend above the baseline, and their max height is determined by the cap line. The cap line is a ceiling that stops the uppercase letters of a font. Fonts with large differences between the baseline and the cap line often feel very fancy or luxurious, and they're often used for fashion magazines or high-end articles of clothing. Now, if you look at any font, you can also see that the lowercase letters have their own invisible line constraining their size. This line is called the X height, and some typefaces even let you manipulate the X height to get even more variability in your design. Going back to our grade school handwriting books, this dotted line in the center is the X height. So the baseline, cap line, and X height make up our measurements for a single line of text. But what about the space between lines of text? In print typography, that's known as leading, and in digital design, it's called the line height. Leading and line height are measured from baseline to baseline, and you can manipulate the line height to increase the legibility of your text at different sizes. Generally speaking, the default line height doesn't look very good. It's about 125% of the font size, and it's the default on most design softwares to look okay at a lot of different sizes, but it doesn't fit one size perfectly. The rule of thumb for line height is that it's inversely proportional to the size of your font. So your biggest headline might have a line height that's exactly equal to the size of your text, while the smallest paragraph might have a line height that's 1.5 times bigger than your paragraph. These aren't hard and fast rules, and they'll change depending on the font you're working with, but it's important to be aware of line height because it plays a huge role in legibility. There's another component of spacing that also plays a huge role in legibility. That's the spacing between characters in a font, which in physical print is called tracking, and in digital design is called letter spacing. Letter spacing is also inversely proportional to size. The bigger the text, the more the eye has to move to read each letter. To minimize this visual strain, putting letters 1 or 2 pixels closer together can dramatically improve legibility and the aesthetics of your design. At smaller sizes, the space between letters should be increased slightly so you can more easily make out individual characters. There's nothing worse than trying to read a paragraph where the letters are bleeding into each other and you can't tell where one letter stops and another begins. Now, every font that isn't monospaced comes with its own default character spacing. Instead of uniformly setting spaces between letters, most fonts have more space between certain letters or letter combinations. This is called kerning. Letter combinations like W and A have more space between them, so you can tell the slants in each letter apart. If you're working in a design software like Adobe Illustrator, you can manipulate the kerning of individual characters to achieve a certain effect. For example, the designer Jessica Hish redesigned the Southern Living logo to very subtly change the kerning between letters to make it more legible without dramatically changing the look and feel of the logo. So now we've adjusted our size, weight, line height, letter spacing, and kerning to look more visually appealing. But there's still one more important variable that can make or break the legibility of your text. That variable is called accessible contrast, and it's the color difference between your typography and the background. Back in the day of Flash websites, a lot of the text on the internet was notoriously difficult to read. So in 1999, the World Wide Web Consortium published guidelines for accessibility on the web. They use a formula to calculate a ratio between darkness and lightness for typography. Generally, text is accessible if you have a contrast ratio of 7:1 or greater. WebAIM.org actually has a great contrast calculator that you can use to make sure your text is legible at small and large sizes. So now we have all the tools to make an individual block of text look good. Our next question is, how do we combine different text styles together to create a cohesive look and feel across our entire design? This is called a typography system. Building one makes our whole design look clean, consistent, and makes creating new text sections as easy as putting together Lego pieces. The basis of our system is typographical hierarchy. The idea is to create rules for each text type in our design so that our design is easy to read and navigate. This hierarchy is generally divided into 4 categories: headings, paragraphs, buttons, and labels. In web design, we have 6 heading options, H1 through H6. We don't have to use all 6 options, often 2 or 3 are enough. To build our heading hierarchy, we start by defining the largest heading style. We'll set the size, weight, line height, and letter spacing to something that looks good for our project, and then adjust those parameters to get smaller, thinner, and more spaced out the smaller we go. After we design our headings, it's time to design our paragraphs, buttons, and labels. In general, we follow the same rules as our headings. The smaller the text, the thinner and more spaced out it'll be. An important exception is the button, which is often bolder than the paragraph so visitors to a website know where to click. To compensate for this increased weight, we'll increase the letter spacing slightly to avoid squishing the characters. Finally, labels are often designed to be smaller than paragraphs with less color contrast. Designers use them for annotations above images or as pop-ups inside paragraphs. Now that we have a hierarchy in place, the last thing to define is the spacing between text elements in our design. This is called designing around a grid because we use grid boxes to define how far text can go before wrapping. In web design, you want to use 12 columns because it's a very divisible number. Your headline might take up all 12 columns, whereas a paragraph might only take up 6, and a button takes up just 1. In print, you usually have 2 columns on each page. Most paragraphs take up both columns, but you can include information boxes in one column and wrap the paragraph around it if you so choose. Newspapers generally follow a 6-column grid, magazines use a 3-column grid, and posters are often designed around the golden ratio. Whatever spacing system you use, it's important to maintain consistency for a clean and professional design. If you want to learn more about how spacing can make or break your design and how to implement it easily on your website, check this video out I made on the 4-pixel rule. And if you found this video helpful, let me know in the comments or by sending me a message by email or social media.